my feet in motion. Since I met you, I swear
For nearly a decade, Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani felt like one of America's great modern love stories. He was the quiet force of Oklahoma country music, a man shaped by open fields, old guitars, and the kind of heartbreak you don't talk about but never outrun. She was the Californian spark bright, rebellious, the voice of an entire generation who learned to heal through her songs. When these two worlds collided, it felt as if the universe had stitched together two broken pieces that somehow belonged. And for years, they showed up everywhere, side by side. Every red carpet, every award night, every moment the cameras turned, they appeared almost inseparable, laughing, touching, leaning into each other like the world finally made sense when they stood together. But then came the night that changed everything. For the first time in 15 years, Blake Shelton did not appear at the Country Music Awards, and neither did Gwen. A couple who almost never missed a major event simply vanished from the one stage where Blake had always felt most at home. He had confirmed his attendance weeks earlier. Then, just 10 days before the show, everything went silent. No reason, no explanation, only a brief announcement that he wouldn't be there, followed by a strange and heavy quiet from both of them. So the question hangs in the air like a crack in the spotlight. What happens to a marriage when even the cameras can no longer hide the distance between two people who once rescued each other? If Blake and Gwen have ever meant something to you, if their music lived inside your memories, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell us which song or moment made you believe in their story. Because to understand how a love like theirs reaches a night like this, we have to return to the beginning, to the childhoods that shaped the hearts they carried into each other's arms. Long before the world ever paired their names together, Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani were shaped by two entirely different universes, two childhoods so far apart in color, rhythm, and expectation that it almost feels impossible they would one day meet in the middle of the same love story. Blake grew up in Oklahoma, where the land is wide, the sky is quiet, and the days unfold with the slow patience of a life built from hard work. His family lived simply, without spectacle, without noise, without the glitter that follows him now. There were chores before school, long evenings when the only sound was the wind pushing through dry grass, and the silent understanding that boys were expected to become men before they even understood what manhood meant. In those early years, Blake learned the language of quiet resilience. He learned that strength was something you carried without complaint, and that emotions were things you tucked into your back pocket until they faded. In a world like that, tenderness wasn't spoken. It was shown in small, steady ways: a hand on the shoulder, a repaired fence, a father's approving nod. Music became his refuge. It was the one place where silence turned into meaning. A guitar could say what he never felt allowed to speak, and a melody could hold the weight of emotions he didn't know how to express. His introversion wasn't shyness, it was survival. His need for space wasn't distance, it was the only way he knew how to breathe. Gwen's beginnings could not have been more different. She grew up in California, surrounded by the colorful chaos of a family that loved creativity, sound, and expression. Her world was filled with music rehearsals in the living room, bright clothes, louder personalities, and the sense that art wasn't just something you consumed, it was something you lived. She was encouraged to express herself, to turn feelings into lyrics, to explore, to color outside the lines. Her identity was crafted from the electric pulse of pop culture and the belief that emotion is not something to hide, but something to transform into art. Where Blake learned to love through quiet loyalty, Gwen learned to love through presence, through laughter, conversation, shared moments, the electricity of being truly seen. She believed that love was a collaboration, a duet. Blake believed it was a shelter, a place to rest. Two childhoods, two emotional languages, one rooted in stillness, the other in movement, one shaped by silence, the other by sound. And yet, these differences would one day draw them to each other. There is a kind of magnetism between souls formed by opposing elements. Blake was drawn to the bright, fearless way Gwen carved music out of her heart. Gwen was drawn to the steady, grounded way Blake held the world together with quiet hands. They recognized something in each other that they didn't have themselves and that, in the beginning, felt like completion. But those same origins, their emotional DNA, also planted the seeds of future struggles. Blake's instinct to retreat when life feels heavy could feel like abandonment to someone like Gwen, who equates love with connection. Gwen's instinct to share, to talk, to reach out could feel overwhelming to someone like Blake, who has always needed silence to process his own storms. Their childhoods didn't just shape who they were, they shaped the way they loved, the way they fought, and the way they tried to hold on to each other when life became too loud or too quiet. Still, before the tension, before the cracks, there was the rise. Two young artists, one discovering his voice on dusty Oklahoma stages, the other exploding into the spotlight of California's music scene, each chasing a dream that would eventually lead them into the same room, under the same lights, into the same story. And to understand how that collision changed everything, we have to follow them into the years when ambition became a calling, when music became survival, and when two very different lives began rising toward the same impossible intersection. Before they ever stood together on a stage, Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani were climbing two very different mountains, each carved by loss, ambition, and the stubborn will to keep going even when the world felt impossibly heavy. Blake's rise began in the quiet corners of Oklahoma, where he played to small crowds who came for cold beer and familiar songs. Not for the boy with the deep voice and the long-held hurt buried behind it. His father's presence shaped him, but so did his father's absence when he died. That loss cracked Blake open in ways he never spoke about publicly, but it seeped into every note he sang. Music wasn't just a dream anymore. It became the thread that held him together. The first few years weren't glamorous. They were nights of hauling equipment through back doors, long drives between towns, learning to sing over people who weren't listening. But the grit of country music, its honesty, its vulnerability, its roots in everyday pain was exactly where Blake belonged. The songs he wrote carried the weight of empty kitchen chairs, the echo of footsteps that would never return, the grief of a man trying to honor the past while stepping into a future that demanded he keep moving. When Nashville finally noticed him, it wasn't because he shouted the loudest. It was because he sang the truth the way only someone who lived it could. His rise was steady, grounded, defined by a kind of humility that made people believe in him. But success didn't erase his loneliness. It simply gave him brighter stages to stand on while carrying the same quiet ache inside. Gwen's ascent was the opposite: loud, fast, electric. She stepped into the world through No Doubt, a band fueled by raw youth, burning ambition, and the chaos of Southern California. The early days were a whirlwind of garage rehearsals, hand-me-down vans, tiny clubs, and the kind of hunger that made every setback feel like a dare. When they broke through big. Gwen became the face of a movement fearless, stylish, heartbreakingly open. But the spotlight came with its own storms. As the band's fame grew, so did the pressure on her shoulders. She was the voice, the symbol, the one expected to carry their emotional truth. And when her long-term relationship fell apart, one that had been intertwined with the band's entire identity, the grief didn't stay private. It spilled directly into her songwriting. Heartbreak became her canvas, and the world listened. Hits like Don't Speak and Cool weren't just songs. They were confessions disguised as pop anthems. Even as she conquered charts and stages, Gwen often stood alone at the center of a noise she couldn't escape. She was beloved, admired, worshipped, but rarely understood. Fame magnified her, but it didn't spare her. Two artists, two different rises. One built from silence and resilience, the other built from color and chaos. Yet beneath the surface, they shared a haunting similarity. Both were fighting battles the world couldn't see. Both were grieving losses while performing smiles. Both carried dreams bigger than their fear, but also wounds deeper than applause could ever heal. And as fate would have it, two very different paths. One carved across Oklahoma prairies, the other carved through California neon, were heading toward an unexpected collision. Their lives were rising toward a point where music, pain, and timing would intertwine in a way neither of them could have predicted. Because every ascent, no matter how different, eventually reaches a moment when the universe decides it's time for two stories to meet under the same unforgiving lights. When Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani finally met on the set of The Voice, it wasn't the kind of encounter Hollywood usually orchestrates. It didn't feel manufactured or rehearsed. It felt like two people both carrying the bruises of public heartbreaks, suddenly recognizing a familiar kind of loneliness in each other. There was an unguarded softness in the way Blake looked at her, a quiet steadiness Gwen didn't know she was still allowed to receive. And America saw it immediately. Their chemistry wasn't explosive in a dramatic sense. It was healing. It was the kind of connection that makes people believe in timing, in second chances. In the strange way, broken people can sometimes fit together better than whole ones. The country boy with the heavy heart and the California icon with the restless spirit somehow created a space on that stage where pain didn't feel like an ending, but a beginning. As their affection deepened, the world leaned in. Suddenly, their smiles backstage meant something. The way Gwen lit up when Blake teased her became a kind of cultural comfort. Soon they weren't just two celebrities, they were a brand of hope. They recorded duets that blended his rugged country warmth with her melodic vulnerability. They posed for magazine covers, spoke gently about each other in interviews, and shared glimpses of a life that looked almost too simple and too sweet to belong to the industry they lived in. Then came the images from Blake's Oklahoma ranch, Gwen in boots, laughing with his family, her sons running across fields, and Blake looking more at ease than he had in years. Fans saw those photos as proof that love could transform a life, that a pop queen and a country king could build a world that felt cozy, genuine, almost domestic. They became America's comforting odd couple, a reminder that even the most unexpected hearts can find a place to rest. But fame has a way of turning even the gentlest love into a fragile performance. As the light around them grew brighter, so did the shadows that followed. Their schedules began pulling them in opposite directions. Gwen dove into fashion lines, studio sessions, and television appearances in Los Angeles, the pulse of her creativity. Blake retreated deeper into Oklahoma, into the quiet spaces that had always been his anchor. Their worlds, once beautifully intertwined, began to drift as their individual identities reclaimed pieces of them. Friends noticed the shift first. Blake missing events Gwen attended with her family, Gwen taking solo trips without the man who used to be always by her side. The industry whispered about their differences, how one thrived in noise while the other found peace only in silence. Even in their interviews, subtle pauses emerged, hesitations where once there had been effortless alignment. The pressure to maintain their perfect image only added weight. Every red carpet became a test. Every interview became an examination. Every smile had to radiate reassurance. And somewhere inside that polished glow, tiny cracks began forming, so small at first that even they may not have noticed. Because the truth is, love often begins in shared pain but is tested by the quiet, ordinary days that follow. And as their careers surged and their responsibilities widened, those quiet days grew rarer. The bond that once healed them now had to survive distance, conflicting lifestyles, and the private struggles that never make headlines. It was in this golden era, when the world believed they were unshakable, that the first shadows of strain appeared. They didn't explode, they whispered. A missed event, a canceled appearance, a subtle change in posture, a silence on social media that felt heavier than words. And it is here, in the brilliance of their shared peak, that the stage is set for everything that would come next: the unraveling, the distance, and the night both of them disappeared from the CMAs. The signs didn't arrive all at once. They crept in quietly, the way distance often does, not through one dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small shifts that only make sense when you look back and see the pattern they formed. 6 months before the night they vanished from the CMAs, whispers began circulating around Nashville. Blake Shelton was seen arriving at his private studio alone night after night, long after most artists had gone home. Staff in the same building mentioned he looked exhausted, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work but from something far heavier. 2 in the morning, sometimes 3. He stayed until the lights in the halls dimmed and the world outside went silent. And, for the first time in years, Gwen wasn't with him. The woman who used to sit beside him during sessions, who once made Tennessee feel like a second home, was now miles away. Meanwhile, Gwen was increasingly anchored in Los Angeles. Fashion projects, beauty lines, studio work, her world was expanding again, pulsing with color and momentum. But Blake's world was shrinking toward Oklahoma, toward the stillness and familiarity he had always turned to when life felt too loud. They weren't just living apart physically. They were retreating into the emotional landscapes shaped by their childhoods, his shaped by silence, hers shaped by expression. Friends began speaking cautiously, saying things like, "They're spending a lot of time in different places," or "their schedules just aren't aligning." But beneath those polite explanations lay an undeniable truth. They hadn't spent more than a few consecutive days together since late September. For a couple who once stitched their lives seamlessly into one, this new distance was stark. Then came the cancellations. Blake quietly backed out of a Grand Ole Opry performance, something he had never taken lightly. A charity event he attended for a decade suddenly went on without him. And by the time the CMAs approached, even insiders couldn't ignore the growing list of disappearances. Gwen, too, was missing from events she normally embraced, choosing instead to remain in California. Social media only deepened the unease. Gwen's Instagram, once a mosaic of shared moments, ranch weekends, backstage snapshots, sweet glimpses of ordinary life, turned silent for 2 months. No updates. No photos with Blake. Nothing. Blake's page was even more telling. Dogs. Cattle. Wide Oklahoma fields, but no trace of Gwen. 2 people who once showed the world their affection as naturally as breathing, now appeared to be living parallel lives, barely touching. And then came the factor no one wanted to mention, but everyone noticed. Miranda Lambert. She was at the CMAs that night. glowing under the lights in a way that drew every camera. For Gwen, who had always carried the ghost of Blake's past marriage with quiet dignity, the thought of sharing that building, those hallways, with Miranda may have felt like a weight too heavy to bear. Some whispered that Gwen declined the event first, and Blake followed out of loyalty. Others believed Blake didn't want Gwen to face the whispers, the cameras, the comparisons. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. Something had shifted so deeply that even the CMAs, an event Blake had honored for 15 straight years, could no longer hold them together in the same room. And if, as you listen now, you feel a heaviness settling in your chest, you're not alone. These moments, these quiet unravelings, always hurt more than the scandals the tabloids invent. If this part of their story shocks you, or if you wish you could tell Blake and Gwen something, anything, share it in the comments. And if someone you know once believed in their love the way you did, send them this video. And subscribe so you don't miss the stories behind moments the industry never explains. Because at some point, the world stopped seeing the cracks. The smiles vanished from Instagram. The red carpets went empty. The music grew too quiet. And what remains now is a question only they can answer. When the world stops seeing the cracks, what truth remains between two people who once saved each other? When people talk about Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani now, they reach instinctively for dramatic explanations: betrayal, jealousy, scandal, secrets. But the truth, the deeper truth that rarely makes headlines, is quieter than that. It's not about a broken promise or a third person in the shadows. It's about something far more human, far more universal. Two people who loved each other out of loneliness, and who began to drift apart when that loneliness changed shape. Their love was born at a time when both of them were hurting in ways the public could see but could never fully understand. Blake was grieving a marriage that had ended painfully, carrying the weight of memories that wouldn't settle. Gwen was emerging from a heartbreak that forced her to rebuild her sense of self in front of millions. They didn't fall in love because everything was perfect. They fell in love because everything was falling apart, and they found shelter in each other's broken places. But healing changes you. It changes what you need, what you chase, what you fear, what you run toward when life grows uncertain again. For Blake, healing meant slowing down. After leaving The Voice, a show that shaped a decade of his life, he found himself searching for the version of Blake Shelton who existed before fame demanded so much of him. He returned to Oklahoma more and more, to the earth that raised him and the silence that steadied him. He wanted mornings without cameras, nights without headlines, days shaped not by industry demands, but by the rhythm of land, weather, and the simplicity he had missed for years. He wasn't running from something. He was running back to something. For Gwen, healing led her in the opposite direction. As she rebuilt her identity, she stepped into a new creative era: fashion partnerships, beauty lines, music experiments, Vegas shows. She found excitement again in reinvention, in the glow of city lights, in the energy of reinvention that California had always given her. She wasn't clinging to fame. She was rediscovering a part of herself she had been forced to dim for too long. Two people who once ran toward each other now ran toward themselves. That doesn't make them selfish. It makes them human. Love often begins as shelter, but it cannot remain shelter forever. At some point, every person has to walk out into the world again and figure out who they are outside the arms that held them through the storm. Picture them like this: two figures standing at the edges of a wide river. Years ago, the current pushed them toward each other with comforting force, and they swam until their hands touched. But as time passed, the current shifted. The water began pulling them in different directions, not violently, not cruelly, just naturally. And no matter how much they reached across the waves, they found themselves drifting not because they wanted to, but because the river beneath them had changed. The tension the public senses, now the distance, the silence. The missing red carpets is not the collapse of a love built on lies. It is the evolution of a love built on survival, a love that may no longer need to be the refuge it once was. A love now facing the quiet question: what happens when two healed hearts seek futures that do not align the way their wounds once did? This is not the story of a scandal. It's a story of timing, of transformation, of two people learning that the versions of themselves who fell in love are not the same versions who must decide what comes next. And as we move toward the ending, toward what remains after the noise fades, it becomes clear that their legacy is not defined by the questions tabloids ask, but by the truth they lived. Two souls who found each other when they needed each other, and who may now be learning the hardest part of love, the part where you decide what it means to stay, and what it means to let go with grace. If you picture them now, it is not under stage lights or in front of cameras. It is in the small, quiet moments where truth tends to live. Blake stands in Oklahoma, his hand resting on the worn leather of an old saddle, the kind his father once used, the kind that holds memories more than purpose. The fields around him sway with the gentleness of a life he has longed to return to, and in that stillness, you can almost hear the part of him that needed silence more than applause. Across the country, in a Los Angeles studio washed in soft white light, Gwen leans over a microphone. A single note plays back through the speakers, beautiful, fragile, reflective. She listens, and for a brief second, her eyes soften, as if remembering a version of herself who once healed inside the warmth of Blake's quiet world. Their love did what many loves never get the chance to do. It saved two people when they needed saving most. It taught millions to believe in second chances, in unexpected beginnings, in the strange and tender ways life brings souls together when both are breaking. No one is the villain here. No one is to blame. They are simply navigating the difficult season of two hearts growing, changing, and learning what love means after the storm has passed. If their journey stayed with you tonight, let the world know they mattered. Like this video as a small tribute. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more human stories behind familiar faces. And send this to someone who once believed in Blake and Gwen the way you did. Some loves don't end. They simply grow into a quieter shape, one that the world may never see, but the heart never forgets.